Hi, I'm Breanna Zinky, and I'll be presenting about the Battle of Yorktown as experienced by the British. The American Revolutionary War has been going on for 3 years and was at a stalemate in the northern and middle colonies by 1778. Because of this, British focused on devising a new strategy. The new plan was called the Southern Strategy. They would take control over one colony at a time, re-establishing ties to the British monarchy while working their way up from Georgia, all with help from loyalists in the colonies. This is the main reason why the British began to focus on war efforts in the South, eventually leading to British General Charles Cornwallis stationing a British army in Yorktown. General Charles Cornwallis is a very key figure at this time on the British side. He was second in command to General Henry Clinton and was responsible for leading British troops in the Battle of Yorktown. He was also responsible for many British victories already achieved in the North. In 1780 and early 1781, Cornwallis led his victorious British army out of Charleston and through the Carolinas. As following the Southern plan, he was working his way up from Georgia. In North Carolina, in March of 1781, Cornwallis engaged in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The British won this battle, but the forces led by Cornwallis were greatly weakened. Because of his weakened forces, he decided alone, without approval from his first-in-command, General Sir Henry Clinton, to instead head to Virginia rather than back to South Carolina. He believed that taking control of Virginia would allow the southern colonies to be defeated more easily. Before the Battle of Yorktown, Lafayette, a French general, was commanding remaining continental troops in Virginia, which wasn't a lot. Cornwallis led his army to push Lafayette's forces north. After chasing down Lafayette's troops, Cornwallis decided to return back to the coast of the Chesapeake Bay. Lafayette followed Cornwallis back, gaining more troops and joining other continental forces in the meanwhile. British commanding General Sir Henry Clinton then ordered Cornwallis to take defense at Yorktown. Clinton expected a siege to occur where he was stationed in New York, so he also ordered Cornwallis to send part of his troops to New York. And here on this map, you can just see the routes of Lafayette's army and Cornwallis's army, as Cornwallis chased Lafayette's army and pushed it north and then eventually arrived in Yorktown. Cornwallis prepared for a march over the James River to Portsmouth, where he could then direct troops to be sent to Clinton in New York. Clinton, however, did not approve of this cross over the river. Cornwallis camped in Green Spring, and as he sent troops over the river, Lafayette and Colonial General Anthony Wayne charged against the British troops. The colonial troops were outnumbered and ended up retreating, but they also managed to momentarily stop the British army from advancing further. This was called the Battle of Green Spring, which was directly before the Battle of Yorktown. After Green Spring, Cornwallis continued to Portsmouth to send British troops to Clinton in New York because, again, a siege was expected there. Clinton then instructed Cornwallis to instead hold his troops and hold position on the peninsula because it would be a good spot for a naval station. Cornwallis decided that the best spot for this naval station would be Yorktown, so that's where he headed. Cornwallis brought 4,500 men with him, arriving in early August, and they began constructing defenses at Yorktown immediately. He established a line of fortifications, building what is called redoubts, which are basically field forts, and batteries, meaning a unit of artillery like cannons. You can see these defenses in the pictures. He also used ravines and creeks around Yorktown as barriers. In the beginning of 1781, Clinton continued to hold New York with 10,000 troops, while Washington opposed him with 3,500. American and French forces knew that they could not face Clinton at the time, so their strategy was to deceive the British to expect an attack in New York. That way troops would be drawn from Cornwallis in the south. This was what occurred, and Clinton expected an attack in New York, which was why he requested troops to be sent from Cornwallis. As Washington began to move his troops towards Yorktown in the south, the British were confused, not knowing what the plan was of the American and French forces. Later, in early September, British Admiral Thomas Graves received an intelligence report that the admiral of the French fleet was headed for Virginia. He immediately took control of the entire British fleet of ships and sailed towards the Chesapeake Bay. And here you can see the route of Admiral Graves heading towards the Chesapeake Bay, and here's the French fleet led by de Grasse. On September 5th, the British fleet led by Graves met the French fleet and they engaged in conflict. The French fleet had more ships, guns, and men, and it ended up destroying and killing more of the British. 24 French ships carrying about 1,700 guns and 19,000 seamen were opposed by 19 British ships with 1,400 guns and 13,000 seamen. The French obviously had more. Casualties for the British were 90 killed and 246 wounded, and the French counted about 200 killed and wounded. Several British ships were also badly damaged. After the first night of conflict between the two fleets, A wind carried them south, and they were too far apart to continue fighting, and British Admiral Graves hesitated to engage in conflict right away again. The French fleet, led by Count de Grasse, then headed back towards the Chesapeake Bay. British Admiral Graves decided to sail for the coast of New York, having great consequences for Cornwallis, who was still in Virginia where colonial forces were collecting in Williamsburg. On September 16th, Clinton sent word to Cornwallis that he would start heading south with a large force for support. It was now clear that an attack was planned on Yorktown. On September 27th, the French and American armies were fully assembled in Williamsburg. The troops totaled to about 15,800. They then began their move towards Yorktown. Cornwallis had about 8,000 troops in Yorktown. On the 29th, he sent word to Clinton that he was going to abandon his outer line of defenses so he could wait for Clinton's troops to arrive rather than holding the outer line and taking offense against the approaching colonial army. Contrary to this, however, the troops sent from New York would only arrive in late October after the battle was over. The colonial forces quickly took advantage of Clinton's withdrawal from the outer line of defenses, and they began constructing their own siege preparations, like shown in the picture. This was all happening on the more southern side of Yorktown. On the west side, the British were also met by an advancing French unit, resulting in several British casualties. Throughout the first few days of October, while colonial forces were preparing for the siege, the British continued to fire artillery upon them. There were multiple complications in the British army, though, such as smallpox breaking out and Cornwallis not having full positions ready. As time went on like this, colonial forces continued to surround Yorktown, trapping the British force and preventing aid from arriving. On October 6, over 4,000 Allied troops marched in to begin the first siege line. The British were not prepared and their guns were not active. The Allied forces dug trenches, set up mortars, and in the next few days it began to bombard Yorktown with mortar fire. Many of the British defenses were destroyed, many men died, and Cornwallis's headquarters were even destroyed. Cornwallis himself was nearly killed at one point. British ships in the harbor were also fired on and destroyed. Cornwallis struggled to keep the British batteries operating during this, leaving them more open to bombardment. After about a week, colonial forces advanced again to form a second siege line closer up. During this, the British attempted to stop them with their guns, cannons, and bombs, but with little success. The British also lost a few of their redoubts, number 9 and 10, because the colonial forces charged upon them in the dark and had the support of the siege lines. Because the colonial forces took the redoubts 9 and 10, they were able to make their second siege line more successful as well. At this time, Cornwallis was desperate. The British positions were ruined, smallpox was spreading through the British, and there were many casualties from the siege fire. He knew if the second siege line was fully completed, British forces would lose very quickly. So, on the night of October 15th, he ordered an attack against the second siege line. This attack was led with only 350 troops and only halted the siege fire for a few hours, ultimately being unsuccessful. In a last-ditch effort, Cornwallis ordered his troops to head to Gloucester Point to cross the river and retreat towards New York. Because of his shortage of boats, along with the raging storm and the French surrounding Gloucester Point, this effort was useless. At this time, Cornwallis knew the situation was hopeless. British suffered 552 casualties compared to 275 for the French and 260 for Americans. Colonial forces had Yorktown surrounded in close range and had greater men and weapons. A council was held with British officers, and Cornwallis decided to surrender and fly a flag of truce. On the morning of October 17th, the British flew a flag of truce. Cornwallis sent a letter to Washington to have officers meet up and negotiate a surrender. The Articles of Capitulation were drafted and then signed by Cornwallis and other British officers. They were surrendered as prisoners of war, and soldiers were kept in prison camps in Virginia, while the officers would have freedom on parole. A formal surrender ceremony was held on the 19th, then marking the end of the siege and eventually the Revolutionary War. After the surrender, the news reached London and public support for the war fell by great amounts. Peace negotiations soon began, and the British also decided they could focus on other more valuable colonies elsewhere. At the time, the Revolutionary War was not seen as completely over, and a formal treaty was not signed until 2 years later. The siege of Yorktown was the last battle of the war, though. From this loss, England was forced to begin negotiating and recognize the colonies separating from the crown. This is the significance of the battle. It effectively marked the end of the war. Conflicts were later seized, and it led to the British withdrawing, allowing the colonists to eventually declare independence and start a new country. Here is a brief timeline to summarize some of the events in the main siege on Yorktown. You can see in early May, Cornwallis and his army entered Virginia, later establishing himself in Yorktown to create a base. In August, the French Admiral de Grasse began to sail towards the Chesapeake Bay with his large fleet. A British fleet led by Thomas Graves intercepted him and then began the Battle of the Capes on September 5th. On September 14th, the British Navy withdrew, leaving Cornwallis isolated in Yorktown with his army. Colonial forces also all arrived at this time. On October 14th, French and American soldiers attacked the British defenses and redoubts in Yorktown after bombarding Yorktown with siege fire. Cornwallis tried to escape but was stopped, and on October 19th, Cornwallis and his forces surrendered. Here are the references I used. The most valuable sources that I used the most information from were multiple books written specifically about the Battle of Yorktown in the Revolutionary War. I found many of my pictures from these sources as well. I also found two journal articles from JSTOR that discuss the British's surrender. I also used a textbook as it briefly talked about my topic. All of the sources I used are scholarly sources that I found from JSTOR or the Muskegon Community College Library online.